Today's number one most urgent vulnerability on the ranked list is CVE 2026-50522 in Microsoft SharePoint Server. And this earns the top spot for a simple reason. It combines a near-maximum CVSS score, confirmed placement in CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog, and an EPSS percentile of 0.98971. In plain English, this is not just a theoretical server bug waiting for a patch cycle. It is a critical SharePoint issue with real exploitation signal behind it. This is the Daily Ranked CVE Brief, What to Patch First, ranked by real exploitation signal from CISA KEV, First EPSS, and CVSS, every day. If SharePoint Server is part of your environment, especially where it is reachable over the network, this is one to move from awareness to action. The affected product is Microsoft SharePoint Server. The official NVD description says this is deserialization of untrusted data in Microsoft Office SharePoint, allowing an unauthorized attacker to execute code over a network. The weakness category is CVE-502, deserialization of untrusted data. Serialization is a normal software pattern where complex data is packaged up, so an application can store it, send it, and later rebuild it. Deserialization is the rebuilding step. The danger comes when an application rebuilds data that came from an untrusted source and treats that data as safe. In the worst cases, that can let an attacker influence what the server creates or runs internally. For defenders, the important takeaway is that the vulnerable logic sits in a server-side pathway, and the impact described for this CVE is remote code execution. Verdict: a 9.8 critical score means this should be treated as an emergency patching candidate, especially on exposed SharePoint Server systems. The two CVSS details that matter most here are reachability and friction. The vector shows AVN, meaning the attack path is over the network, not something that requires local machine access. It also shows PRN and UIN, meaning no privileges are required and no user interaction is required. That combination is what defenders hate to see on server-side enterprise software. The vector also rates confidentiality, integrity, and availability impact as high, which means successful exploitation can potentially affect data exposure, data modification, and service reliability. We do not need to recite every metric to understand the priority: network reachable, unauthenticated, no click needed, critical impact. The biggest reason this CVE is today's number one is not only the 9.8 score, it is the exploitation signal. CVE 2026-50522 is listed in CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog. That means defenders should treat it differently from a critical issue that exists only on paper. The EPSS percentile is also 0.98971, putting it extremely high compared with other vulnerabilities in expected exploitation likelihood. EPSS percentile is not a promise that any one server will be attacked, and it is not a substitute for asset knowledge. But when KEV status, a critical score, and a very high EPSS percentile line up, the practical decision is clear. Do not leave this sitting in a normal monthly queue if SharePoint Server is in scope. Conceptually, here is how to think about the attack path without getting into exploit mechanics. SharePoint Server is designed to receive and process network requests. Somewhere in the affected code path, untrusted data can reach deserialization logic. If that logic accepts attacker-controlled content and reconstructs it as trusted application objects, the server may be pushed into behavior the application never intended. That is why deserialization bugs are so serious. The dangerous part is not simply receiving input, it is rebuilding that input inside a privileged server-side process. For defenders, the practical implication is that perimeter thinking alone is not enough. If a vulnerable SharePoint server can be reached by an unauthorized party over the network, the exposure is meaningful. You should focus first on internet-facing systems, externally reachable portals, and any SharePoint server that bridges sensitive internal data. To determine whether you are affected, start with inventory. Find every Microsoft SharePoint Server instance, including production, disaster recovery, test, staging, and old collaboration systems that may still be reachable. Then separate them by exposure: internet-facing, partner-facing, VPN-only, and internal-only. Do not assume an internal system is safe, but do prioritize anything reachable from outside trusted networks. For exact affected versions, fixed builds, and update guidance, defer to the Microsoft Security Response Center Advisory for CVE 2026-50522. The data we have here does not provide version numbers, so do not rely on guesses or informal naming. Check installed build information against the vendor advisory. Confirm whether the relevant security update has been applied, and document exceptions. If you cannot quickly prove a SharePoint server is patched, treat it as potentially exposed until verified. The primary remediation is to follow Microsoft's advisory for CVE 2026-50522 and apply the appropriate security update for affected SharePoint server deployments. Because this CVE is in CISA KEV, prioritize it ahead of lower signal criticals, especially on network reachable systems. While patching is underway, reduce exposure where possible. Limit access to SharePoint server from untrusted networks, remove unnecessary external paths, and ensure only required users and systems can reach administrative and application interfaces. Also, verify backups and recovery procedures before large-scale changes, because SharePoint can be business-critical and patch windows can be operationally sensitive. After patching, confirm the update actually installed, confirm services are healthy, and rescan or recheck your asset inventory. The goal is not just to deploy a patch, it is to prove that every relevant SharePoint server is either fixed, isolated, or formally risk accepted. For detection and monitoring, look for signs that SharePoint is behaving outside its normal baseline. Start with web access logs, SharePoint application logs, authentication logs, Windows event logs, and EDR telemetry on the SharePoint servers. Watch for unusual request volume, unfamiliar source networks, repeated errors, unexpected server-side exceptions, or crashes and restarts around SharePoint services. Also monitor for behavior that may follow successful code execution. Unexpected child processes from web application worker processes, suspicious file creation or modification, new or changed accounts, unexpected privilege changes, and outbound connections from SharePoint servers that normally should not initiate them. None of these signals proves exploitation by itself, and the data provided does not give a specific indicator list. But together, they form a practical defensive watch list. Establish what normal looks like, then investigate deviations aggressively while patching proceeds. To recap, CVE 2026-50522 is a Microsoft SharePoint Server deserialization flaw, tracked as CVE-502, with a 9.8 critical CVSS score. It is network reachable, requires no privileges, requires no user interaction, and is listed in CISA's Known Exploited Vulnerabilities catalog. That is why it is today's #1 on our ranked list. If you run SharePoint Server, inventory it, check the Microsoft advisory for exact applicability, patch affected systems, reduce unnecessary exposure, and monitor closely for abnormal behavior. This is the Daily Ranked CVE Brief. What to patch first, ranked by real exploitation signal from CISA KEV, First EPSS, and CVSS, every day. Subscribe for the daily priority cut and see the full ranked report linked in the description.